Hello, my name is Beth Fenton, and I'm going to talk about neoliberal financialized capitalism in the USA and how it's made citizens more at risk to commit suicide. On a societal level, neoliberal financialized capitalism is correlated with increasing rates of inequality, which is positively associated with increasing rates of suicide and presumably intense distress proceeding. As well as on an individual level, neoliberal financialized capitalism increases the chance of experiencing financial adversity, which is correlated with the risk of intense distress and suicide. At the end, I will propose addressing suicide with social support as a therapeutic buffer and or political preventative measures. Some definitions for the necessary for the presentation are financialization, which is a type of capitalism that prioritizes profits through financial investment rather than trade or production. Fire sector employees, which is an acronym for financiers, investors, and real estate agents who work for and perpetuate the financialization capitalist system. And then neoliberalism is defined as an economic system which decreases social welfare programs and has less market, corporate, and shareholder control from the government. In my first study, Dr. Roberts studied financialization and inequality in 17 countries with and without neoliberalism. Financialization was measured as the fire sector's percentage of the labor force, which increased by 7.23% from 1985 to 2005, which is shown in the first graph at the top. And the value in this sector increased 11.81% in the same years, which is shown at the bottom, which is the GDP value growth. Gini scale was used to measure inequality as a percentage, and income gap measured wealth inequality as a ratio of the highest to lowest earners. Both increased 7 to 8%. Top 1% of earners' incomes also increased by 62.4%. Dr. Roberts found positive associations between measurements for financialization and inequality. Another study for my research paper by Dr. Zaira focuses on inequality and mental illness from neoliberal capitalism in the USA, and she confirms similar but larger, more concerning and more recent results for the USA. From 1979 to 2009, top 1% of earners had a 160.3% increase in their wages at the expense of the lower class. Continuing from the first study, fire sector's growth was associated with inequality by allowing them to increase their profits. Fire sector employees earn 1.5 to 4 times more than the national median income, while most people affected by inequality make the median income or less. They can increase anti-union activity through mass layoffs, investment in laborless technology, and illegal union discouragement. They can increase disproportionate investing from financial investment returns. Fire sector employees who invest are rewarded a percentage of their invested money for basically letting it sit and do nothing that most people can't afford the same resources to do the same. Income from investment returns accounts for 50% of total income for the most affluent, which is shown in my graph. All this exacerbates income inequality. Effects were found to be stronger in neoliberal capitalist economies as well. So neoliberal financialized capitalism is correlated with escalating economic inequality, as shown by the first two studies. From fire sectors directly taking a greater collection of income and wealth from labor market share, but also indirectly as a result of greater disproportionate bargaining power for financial elites who then reduce employment, pay, unit organization, and more. In my third study, Dr. Hyde concludes incomes of both the middle class and the poor are hurt, resulting from financialized capitalism. He studied 16 countries from 1981 to 2011. He studied unequal income distributions measured as a ratio between percentiles of classes. He found for upper tail inequality, the rich made 1.83 times more income than the median worker globally, and 2.19 times more for the USA. And for lower tail inequality, he found the median worker makes 1.99 times more income than the poor globally and 2.7 times more for the USA. Fire sector employment percentage results here are very similar to Dr. Roberts for the USA as well. On average, fire sector employees make up 11.35% of the workforce globally, and for the USA, 17.84. And that 17.84 number is very similar to previous numbers as well. And this is also shown on the graph on this slide. Fire sector employees take a large percentage of the market income from lower and middle class. Both of these socioeconomic classes make up most of the population are being negatively affected. And upper tail and lower tail inequality disparity shows the poor are economically left behind comparatively to other classes. However, the middle class is also still negatively affected, and one could potentially drop down to lower class. In the fourth study I researched, in a 2019 Harvard experimental paper done by Dr. J, he hypothesizes financial scarcity is associated with higher levels of distress and lower life satisfaction. He did a study testing money and life satisfaction, which had 522 participants, whose incomes ranged from about $10,000 to $150,000. He asked them to journal for 30 days about daily events, as well as their emotional responses to such events. People with higher incomes were found to be generally more satisfied with life and less affected by stress. That is, and this is a quote, money can help people resolve and prevent problems, allowing people to effectively buy themselves out of distressing events they encounter or before they even occur. Victims of inequality experience financial adversity correlated with distress and suicide. The first two studies show neoliberal capitalism contributes to social level economic inequality and individual level likelihood of financial adversity, which are heavily correlated with intense distress and suicide. The third study shows when one faces more financial adversity, they are more likely to experience intense levels of distress, which could affect their risk or level of life satisfaction. And then I created this model in figure 1 to show, to represent this, this model. So neoliberal capitalism financialization increases, which then increases the likelihood of economic circumstances to become negative. So not negative in quantity, but not good. So it increases socially with inequality rates and individually with possibility of encountering financial adversity. And then this increases the chance of intense distress and suicide. And this is societally with rates of suicide, but also individually with risk after adversity. So my analysis is that capitalism is an unsustainable system incompatible with human nature. USA needs large-scale change and or a new therapy technique to address these issues. This model that I showed previously shows financial inequality and insecurity results in increased likelihood of mental illness, intense distress, and suicide. Yet capitalism continues to depend on keeping a specific proportion of the population financially insecure despite this risk. Capitalism seems to purposefully keep specific groups without power, and that needs an entire change. The specific disenfranchised groups mentioned in my paper and presentation would be those prone to mental illness, but other disenfranchised groups mentioned from Dr. Zaira's papers and other researchers' papers could include disabled people, elderly people, Black people, Native Americans, all of these who are more likely to be financially insecure. Large-scale change can be in the form of political actions, such as changing our two-party system and inevitability of capitalism from Republicans, Democrats, right and left. We need to revolutionize the way our politics are structured. A less anarchical tactic could be like economic change in the way we support and regard those in need socially and financially through government aid and capitalist regulation. Um, my research paper mentions six research that I don't go into too much depth in this presentation by Dr. Matthew. And his paper mentions 6 ecological studies that confirm aiding financial adversity through unemployment policies will aid its positively correlated variables, distress and suicide. And this study spans several years in high-income countries. This means research supports social policies as a primary preventative measure for facing suicide rates. This further supports this presented model by confirming hypothesized solutions from researchers, such as Dr. Matthew. Dr. Matthew found unemployment benefits and protection legislation reduced suicide rates for all of the studies. And another study specific to the USA actually showed that increasing minimum wage by $1 reduces the rates of suicide by $6 or by 6% for those with low education, which is a really big statistic. And continuing with my analysis, a quote from Dr. Zaira says, neoliberal financialized capitalism does not only increase distress and mental disorders, but it entirely dictates how we classify disorders and people who fit into the categories. So when diagnosing mental disorders, a medical professional must distinguish between what is or is not normal. And this is within the context of that patient's environment. So this is impacted by economic systems as well, of course. So if life at work or school is negatively affected by their symptoms, they have reached the assessment threshold necessary for it to need correcting. This assumes the person and their symptoms in the system rather than the system itself need to be remedied. Another quote by Dr. Zira that I found really important was, however, prescribing medication and individual psychotherapeutic intervention to help our patients become more successful in the neoliberal capitalist society perpetuates the idea that they are ill and defective for not assimilating, which not only reinforces ideals of individualism, but absolves people in power from the responsibilities for the social conditions and injustices that contribute to distress and suicide. This is against our human nature and it's unsustainable, promotes behaviors and beliefs that mimic abnormal symptoms deemed as mental illness. However, arguably, our economic political system is not normal and creates adverse, upsetting behaviors and risks for distress and suicide. Um, this highlights the assessment flaw for mental illness because of our normalized distressing environment. And the fifth study that I mentioned is actually about integrative community-based therapy as a sort of social support buffer. So neoliberal financialized capitalism affects mental health and mental illness in other less direct ways, such as loss of social community support. Sorry. Dr. Zira found neoliberal financialized capitalism has had an effect for mental health, such as increased loneliness and levels of distrust with others. The effects were found to be greater in countries with higher economic inequality. Social relationships seem to be entirely better in less neoliberal countries. It was found that there were higher levels of trust, more community life involvement, and lower levels of violence as well. It has been studied and known that social ties and community are not only beneficial for mental health, but that mental disorders are more common for people with fewer social or community relations. And in the United States of America, a very neoliberal financialized capitalist country, community involvement has fallen 45% from 1985 to 1994. Along similar lines, marriage rates have been declining as well in the United States of America, showing that social support seems to be dwindling here. And this information was from Dr. Zira's research paper. Neoliberal financialized capitalism promotes competition and mistrust, which affects social support buffers necessary to cope with intense distress and suicidal symptoms. With this information, I believe that community and social relationships acts as a sort of buffer for distress and suicide. Particular to my research, symptoms specifically from effects of neoliberal financialization capitalism, such as macro-scale economic inequality and individual financial adversity. This buffer could be useful for providing integrative community-based therapy specified in my research paper conclusion as well. And then this is the figure 2, which is the model for the social support buffer from community and relationships, or more specifically, the integrative community therapy. So community and social relationships acts as a sort of buffer between financial adversity and distress and suicide. Community and relationships can decrease risk of distress and suicide. And then, of course, there's some limitations in possible compounds. A lot of this research is correlational because causal evidence would result in distress or suicide, which is highly unethical, of course. And experiments like the Harvard study research as much as ethically possible to like isolate the independent variable, but it can be very unethical to try to do an experiment with like direct results. And of course, there can be confounds as well. So similar to how the social support buffer kind of affects those variables, confounds could also be affecting the variables. So technology rise, media rise, social media rise, sorry, technology rise, two different things I categorize them as personally. Technology rise, like the resource and the actual physical technology, but then also media, like social media rise and the way that that affects communication and relationships and stuff. And then social support buffer declining itself could be a possible confound that's affecting this model. And then these are all my references and resources that I utilized for this presentation and for my research paper. And my name was Beth Fenton again.